From New York, this is Democracy Now!
The judge who put Lula in prison in 2018 when all polls showed that Lula would likely win the presidency, which is what enabled Bolsonaro to actually win, that his primary adversary was imprisoned. And then he took the judge who put Lula in prison and made him the justice minister.
A political crisis is growing in Brazil after The Intercept revealed the judge who helped jail former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva likely aided the federal prosecutors who targeted him. Leaked documents also reveal the prosecutors had serious doubts about Lula's guilt.
I continue challenging Judge Moro and the appellate court to show the world and to show Brazil a single piece of evidence of a crime committed by me.
Porque o comportamento do Poder Judiciário nesse instante.
The behavior of the judiciary in this instance is a political form of behavior.
We'll go to Rio de Janeiro to speak with the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald of The Intercept, who broke the story. Then we look at horrific conditions for immigrants held in for-profit detention jails around the country.
It was sad. It was sad for me. For all of us, it was sad. We cried and everything. We suffered. You know, in our way of suffering for everything, we suffer a lot. I am strong, but I feel like crying for everything today.
At least 24 immigrants have died in the custody of Immigration and Customs Enforcement under Trump. Now, Homeland Security's own Inspector General has revealed how detained immigrants are subjected to rotten food, severe overcrowding, inadequate medical care, and broken and overflowing toilets. We'll get the latest from Aura Bogado, immigration reporter for Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Hong Kong, protesters and police have been clashing in the second mass demonstration in recent days against the proposed bill to allow extradition of Hong Kong residents to mainland China. Riot police deployed tear gas, rubber bullets, and pepper spray against demonstrators in front of government buildings. Earlier in the day, lawmakers announced they'll postpone today's debate on the contested legislation. Critics of the bill say it would infringe on Hong Kong's independence and the legal and human rights of Hong Kong residents. In Arizona, a case against a humanitarian aid volunteer who provided food, water, and shelter to undocumented migrants ended in a mistrial Tuesday after a deadlocked jury was unable to deliver a verdict. Scott Warren from the group No More Deaths and Aho Samaritans faced up to 20 years in prison after being charged with 2 counts of felony for harboring and 1 count of felony conspiracy. 8 jurors found Scott Warren not guilty. 4 said he was guilty. Prosecutors have declined to comment on whether they'll seek a retrial against Warren. This is Scott Warren speaking to reporters and supporters and the press at yesterday's mistrial.
Since my arrest in January of 2018, at least 88 bodies were recovered from the Aho corridor of the Arizona desert. We know that's a minimum number and that many more are out there and have not been found. The government's plan in the midst of this humanitarian crisis: policies to target undocumented people, refugees, and their families. Prosecutions to criminalize humanitarian aid, kindness, and solidarity. And now, where I live, the revelation that they will build an enormous and expensive wall across a vast stretch of southwestern Arizona's unbroken Sonoran Desert. House lawmakers voted Tuesday to authorize the Judiciary Committee to sue the Trump administration in federal court to enforce subpoenas for former White House counsel Don McGahn and Attorney General William Barr. Lawmakers are seeking documents and testimony from McGahn related to the Mueller inquiry and possible obstruction of justice by President Trump. The committee will hold off for now on enforcing Barr's
subpoena after the Justice Department agreed Monday to hand over some of the underlying evidence from the Mueller report. Meanwhile, the Justice Department revealed Tuesday they'll recommend Trump use executive privilege to block contempt citations against Barr and Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross over their refusal to hand over documents related to adding a citizenship question to the 2020 census. The House Oversight Committee is voting on the contempt procedure today. Meanwhile, Donald Trump Jr. is set to testify in a closed-door hearing before the Senate Intelligence Committee today. The Republican-led panel subpoenaed him last month after he twice refused to testify about his role in matters related to the Russia investigation, including the 2016 Trump Tower meeting and the Trump Tower Moscow project. In Moscow, local reports say Russian police have detained nearly 100 people, including opposition politician Alexei Navalny, at a protest condemning police corruption over the recent arrest of independent journalist Ivan Golanov. Golanov was released Tuesday following widespread public outcry. Golanov, who reported on corruption and press censorship, was arrested last week and accused of drug dealing in what his lawyers and press freedom advocates say were fabricated charges after police planted fake evidence. He has since been cleared of the charges, and the arresting officers in the case have been suspended pending the results of an internal inquiry. Golanov's reporting included an investigation into the finances of Moscow's deputy mayor's family, the funding of public works in Moscow, and efforts to suppress press freedom. Russian press also rallied around Golanov, with 3 major business newspapers publishing matching front pages Monday to call out his arrest. Russia ranks number 149 in Reporters Without Borders' 2019 World Press Freedom Index, which describes Russia as having a, quote, stifling atmosphere for independent journalists. In Saudi Arabia, a Houthi missile raid on an airport in the southwest of the country has wounded at least 26 civilians, according to a statement by the Saudi-led coalition. A number of children were reportedly among the injured civilians who were taken to a nearby hospital. The attack comes a day after Saudi officials said it intercepted 2 Houthi drones in the south of Saudi Arabia. No damage or casualties reported from the attack. The ongoing war in Yemen between the U.S.-backed Saudi coalition and Houthi rebels has led to the world's worst humanitarian disaster. The United Nations estimates the combined death toll from fighting, hunger, and disease has reached nearly 250,000 since the start of the conflict. In Sudan, protest leaders and the ruling Transitional Military Council have agreed to resume talks following a bloody military crackdown on nonviolent demonstrators. Protest leaders say an ongoing civil disobedience action will be halted for now. The news was delivered by Ethiopian mediators in Sudan. A group of doctors involved in the protest movement say at least 118 people have been killed since the crackdown at the protest site on Monday. Doctors also say paramilitaries with the Rapid Support Forces committed at least 70 rapes since the raid. Sudan's military took power in April after a months-long popular uprising led to the overthrow of the longtime authoritarian President Omar al-Bashir, who's currently in prison. In Botswana, LGBTQ and human rights advocates celebrated Tuesday as the country overturned long-standing laws that criminalize same-sex relations. The historic ruling came after a 21-year-old student brought a case against the colonial-era law under which anyone found guilty of committing homosexual acts could face up to 7 years behind bars. A statement by the advocacy group Lesbians, Gays and Bisexuals of Botswana said, quote, "Not only does the decision provide legal affirmation and recognition of the rights of LGBTIQ persons, but it allows an important space for addressing public health issues more efficiently. We can finally start building a more tolerant society," they said. Back in the U.S., Acting Homeland Security Secretary Kevin McAleenan told Congress Tuesday that 60,000 children have been taken into DHS custody in the last 40 days alone. Critics say McAleenan's testimony is part of an ongoing effort to build up a case for more border funding. His hearing came ahead of a planned vote by the Senate Appropriations Committee next week on President Trump's request for $4.5 billion in emergency spending tied to the U.S.-Mexico border. Meanwhile, immigration and human rights advocates are continuing to raise alarm over the dire conditions in which migrant children are being locked up. We'll have more on that report later in the show. Meanwhile, immigration hardliner Ken Cuccinelli has assumed the role of acting head of Citizenship and Immigration Services. Several top Republicans have come out against Cuccinelli's temporary appointment, and Senate Whip John Thune warned the Republican-controlled Senate was unlikely to approve a potential nomination for Cuccinelli to become permanent head of the agency. As a state lawmaker in Virginia, Cuccinelli authored legislation seeking to force employees to speak English in the workplace, and he unsuccessfully fought to eliminate the 14th Amendment's birthright citizenship clause. At an emotional congressional hearing Tuesday, Jon Stewart blasted lawmakers for their inaction ahead of a vote on renewing health care funding for 9/11 responders who became sick as a result of their work following the terror attack. The comedian and former host of The Daily Show has been a longtime advocate for the 9/11 responders and has repeatedly called out proposed cuts to the fund, which is set to expire in 2020. New York Democratic Congressmember Carolyn Maloney introduced legislation earlier this year to fund the program permanently. This is Jon Stewart addressing the subcommittee of the House Judiciary panel.
Behind me, a filled room of 9/11 first responders, and in front of me, a nearly empty Congress. Sick and dying, they brought themselves down here to speak to no one. It's shameful. It's an embarrassment to the country, and it is a stain on this institution. And you should be ashamed of yourselves for those that aren't here, but you won't be. Because accountability doesn't appear to be something that occurs in this chamber.
In Alabama, Republican Governor Kay Ivey signed into law a bill mandating child sex offenders undergo chemical castration as a condition of their parole. The law would apply to anyone found convicted of committing a sexual offense with a child under the age of 13. 6 other states have similar laws for certain sex offenders. Medical experts and human rights groups have raised concerns about the practice. The Alabama American Civil Liberties Union says chemical castration is unconstitutional as it violates due process and privacy laws. The executive director of the Alabama ACLU said of the new law, they really misunderstand what sexual assault is about. Sexual assault isn't about sexual gratification. It's about power. It's about control, they said. In reproductive rights news, Vermont Governor Phil Scott signed a bill Monday affirming abortion as a fundamental right. The law prohibits the government from interfering with the decision to get an abortion and protects access to contraception, sterilization, and family planning. A spokesperson for Governor Scott previously said he would not sign the bill passed by Democratic state lawmakers last month, though Vermont law would still have allowed the legislation to go into effect. Meanwhile, in Maine, Democratic Governor Janet Mills signed a bill allowing physician assistants and some registered nurses to perform abortions instead of just doctors, which she says will increase abortion access for Mainers in rural areas. And in New York, housing rights advocates are celebrating after state lawmakers announced an agreement that would provide the strongest tenant protections in over a quarter of a century. The deal came just days ahead of the expiration of the current rent laws at the end of this week. Lawmakers agreed to abolish laws allowing landlords to deregulate rents on apartments after they exceed a certain limit. They also will curb provisions allowing landlords to raise the rent of rent-controlled apartments after renovations. The law is expected to give municipalities around New York more authority to regulate rents and ensure greater access to affordable housing. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Juan, before we move on with our first story, Albany reaching deal to toughen rent protection. Talk about the significance of this.
This is a huge victory, Amy. It was back in the mid-1990s when George Pataki, the Republican governor of New York, was in office, and there was a extreme conservative Republican Senate and a an assembly in New York that was Democratic but really controlled by the landlord lobby. And they really initiated this vacancy decontrol that resulted in about 200,000 rent-regulated units in New York City being decontrolled. Decontrol means the landlords can charge whatever they want. So what happened finally this year, and just in Albany, is this extension, sweeping extension of the rent regulations that will now eliminate vacancy decontrol, that will also prevent landlords. It used to be that an apartment, when it became vacant, the landlord could automatically increase the rent by 20%. That is no longer going to be allowed, and that they cannot jack up major capital improvement prices and then charge the tenants for those improvements. So a lot of that has been eliminated. And most importantly, rent regulations were only in New York City and Yonkers, a few suburban cities. Now any city and county in the state will be able to adopt rent regulations. This means like millions of people in New York State will now have greater protections from their rent rising above their ability to be able to pay.
And what do you think this will mean for the country, for places like San Francisco?
Well, it's already happening in Newark and in several other places in California. Increasingly, rent because housing is for renters has become so exorbitant. More and more local governments are saying we've got to regulate rent. So this is just another huge push in the movement to protect tenants across the country.
And of course, we'll continue to follow this.
Well, a political crisis is growing in Brazil after The Intercept revealed that the judge who helped jail former Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva likely aided federal prosecutors in their corruption case in an attempt to prevent Lula's Workers' Party from winning the presidency. Leaked cell phone messages among Brazilian law enforcement officials and other data obtained by The Intercept point to an ongoing collaboration between Judge Sergio Moro and the prosecutors investigating a sweeping corruption scandal known around the world as Operation Car Wash. Lula was considered a favorite in the lead-up to the 2018 presidential election until he was put in jail and forced out of the race on what many say were trumped-up corruption charges. The leaked documents also reveal that prosecutors had serious doubts about Lula's guilt. The jailing of Lula helped pave the way for the election of the far-right former military officer Jair Bolsonaro, who then named Judge Sergio Moro to be his justice minister.
The Intercept's reporting is based on a trove of internal files and private conversations from the prosecutorial team behind Operation Car Wash. The Intercept has dubbed the files the Secret Brazil Archive. As a result of The Intercept's reporting, Brazil's Supreme Court has announced it'll reconsider an appeal by Lula to be released from prison. Calls are also growing for Sergio Moro to resign as justice minister. The Brazilian Bar Association has called for Moro to be suspended and for all prosecutors involved in the car wash scandal probe to be disbanded. Moro has denied any wrongdoing, claims the messages have been taken out of context. Moro wrote in a statement, quote, "I lament the lack of indication of the source of the person responsible for the criminal invasion of the prosecutor's cell phones, as well as the position of the site that did not contact me before the publication, contrary to basic rule of journalism. As for the content of the messages they mentioned, there is no sign of any abnormality or providing directions as a magistrate, despite being taken out of context and the sensationalism of the articles," he said. Vermont Senator, 2020 presidential candidate Bernie Sanders told The Intercept, "Today it is clearer than ever that Lula da Silva was imprisoned in a politicized prosecution that denied him a fair trial and due process. During his presidency, Lula oversaw huge reductions in poverty and remains Brazil's most popular politician. I stand with political and social leaders across the globe who are calling on Brazil's judiciary to release Lula and annul his conviction," Senator Sanders said. We go now to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, to speak with the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald of The Intercept, who broke the story. So, Glenn, lay out what you exposed in this three-part series. Looks like Glenn is having a little trouble hearing us, so we're going to go to break, and we'll come back to Glenn Greenwald in Rio de Janeiro. Stay with us. Jackson Black Monument Ensemble performing Sounds Like Now. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Our guest is Glenn Greenwald, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, founding editors of The Intercept, just published The Secret Brazil Archive, a three-part expose revealing that the judge overseeing the case that put former Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva behind bars likely aided the federal prosecutors in their case against Lula and other high-profile figures. Lay out what you found in this three-part report, Glenn, and how it's rocking Brazil right now.
Sure. So as your audience likely knows, because I've discussed it with you many times and you've covered it with other guests, Brazil is a country that has been swamped by multiple political crises, the impeachment of former Workers' Party President Dilma Rousseff, who succeeded Lula, the ascension of this far-right president, Jair Bolsonaro, economic crises and the like. But by far the biggest event in Brazil was the imprisonment last year of former President Lula da Silva, not just because he was such a giant on the world stage democratically, which he is, because he was elected overwhelmingly twice in 2002 and 2006. And his presidency was so successful in lifting millions of people out of poverty, in transforming Brazil, that he left Brazil and left office, with an 87% approval rating, which is unheard of. So to put somebody like that in prison is an earth-shattering story in and of itself, but it was made all the more consequential by the fact that all polls showed that Lula, who was running again for president last year, he was term limited out of office the first time, was the overwhelming favorite, was the massive front runner, was ahead by 20 to 30 points in every poll, including ahead of Jair Bolsonaro. And so to imprison Lula meant that he was rendered ineligible under the law to run, and that's what paved the way ultimately for Jair Bolsonaro's ascension to control over Brazil, which is the fifth most populous country in the world with massive oil reserves and the most important environmental resource on the planet, which is the Amazon, all of which is now in the hands of Jair Bolsonaro. This was done by a task force of prosecutors and a judge, Sergio Moro, who have basically been turned into superheroes, into deities by the Brazilian press and by the world press. Sergio Moro was heralded around the world as some great figure. He was named to the Time 100 list in 2016 and went to the gala in New York. He had a huge profile on him on 60 Minutes. That was a puff piece, basically turning him into this noble anti-corruption figure. And there's been almost no questioning of anything that they've done, even though they've been using highly questionable practices. Here in Brazil, there's been a long time suspicion that they, in fact, were abusing their powers for political ends, that what they really were right-wing ideologues and operatives who were abusing the law to destroy the Workers' Party, one of the only left-wing parties in the entire democratic world that has dominated politics in a major country and has succeeded in anti-poverty programs, in order to usher in the pro-right faction into power, that they were abusing the law to basically put the leaders in prison to destroy the party. They've always vehemently denied this. They've said, we have no ideology, we have no party preference, we don't care who wins elections, we're only neutral judges and prosecutors applying the law. The archive that was provided to us by our source, this massive trove of secret documents about their internal communications, about their internal actions, their chats, their audios, their videos, an archive that, as I've said, is bigger in size than the Snowden archive was, which until that point was the largest leak in the history of U.S. journalism. Bigger than that, finally enables us to see the truth about what they really did. And the three stories that we published on Sunday, the reason they've shaken Brazil to the core is because Sergio Moro, after Bolsonaro won, thanks to Justice Moro putting Lula in prison, became the second most powerful person in Brazil because Bolsonaro created what he called a super justice ministry that Sergio Moro now runs. He's the justice minister of the country. It's like being an attorney general, but on steroids, controlling all law enforcement, surveillance, police actions. And what this material shows are three key things. Number one, it shows that inside the prosecutor task force, they were talking openly about how they wanted to make sure that the Workers' Party lost the election. And we can talk about the specifics, but in particular, there was a judge who authorized Lula to give an interview from prison 12 days before the election, and they panicked, and they said, we need to stop this, because if Lula is allowed to be heard from, there's a good chance he will make PT win the election, and we need to put a stop to this. They said they were praying every day that PT doesn't return to power, PT being the Workers' Party. So this 5-year claim that they had, we don't have any preferences for parties, we don't care who wins elections, was an absolute lie. They were talking openly and explicitly about how their top priority was making sure PT didn't win the election, exactly what people have been accusing them of. Secondly, just like in the U.S., a judge is required to be neutral. A judge can't favor one side or the other. And there's long been a suspicion that Judge Morrow, when he was ruling on these cases, like finding Lula guilty, finding other left-wing leaders guilty and people from other parties guilty, that he was in fact collaborating in secret with the prosecutors to design the case. They vehemently and angrily denied this accusation. The head of the prosecutorial task force, who's a national hero in Brazil, Deltan Dallagnol, wrote a book in which he said, these accusations are outrageous, they're disgusting. We have video of Judge Morrow being asked about this, and he was so angry about it that he actually scoffed at it with a smile, saying, people talk about this as being as though it's Judge Morrow's prosecution or Judge Morrow's strategy. He said, people don't understand. Judges in Brazil have no role in prosecuting people. Our value is one of passivity. We simply listen to both sides, listen to the evidence, and make decisions. What the conversations that we publish show between Judge Morrow and the head of the prosecutorial task force is that Judge Morrow, in fact, was constantly directing, constructing, designing the entire prosecution, screaming at them when they were doing things that he thought were wrong, telling them how to better fortify the case, not just against Lula, but against other people. He was basically the commander of the prosecutorial team, and then walking into court as though he were sitting judging Lula's case and others as a neutral arbiter. So everything that they vehemently denied to the public they were doing, in fact, they were doing for years, as these documents show. And then the third key revelation, as you said, is that the specific case for which they prosecuted Lula, namely the charge that he had received what they call a triplex apartment in order to make it sound very glamorous, when in fact it's kind of run down and shoddy, and Lula had the capability to buy it 100,000 times over if he wanted. But the charge was he received this triplex apartment and renovations to it in exchange for helping this construction company get contracts, that they knew themselves 3 days before they indicted him that they didn't have the evidence sufficient to show his guilt or even to justify why this case belonged with them. But they just decided they were going to go forward anyway because they knew they had a judge, in Judge Morrow, now Minister Morrow, single-mindedly devoted to the goal of imprisoning Lula, and not just imprisoning him, but doing so in time to make him ineligible to run for 2018's election out of fear that PT would win the election. So the consequences of this revelation have been enormous because Moro, as I said, is the second most powerful person in Brazil after Bolsonaro, but he's by far the most respected person, or at least was the most respected person. And even his most ardent and loyal defenders, in light of these revelations, have said there's no way to defend this conduct. One of the biggest right-wing newspapers in Brazil, Estadão de São Paulo, that has spent 4 years praising and heralding and cheerleading for Sergio Moro, came out and said he needs to resign and the head of the task force needs to be fired, just based on the first 3 stories that we publish, and that's indicative and reflective of widespread sentiment, and that's why it's shaking Brazil to the core, because Sergio Moro is crucial to the legitimacy of the Bolsonaro government.
Glenn,
getting him to go join the government was a crucial part.
Glenn, I wanted to ask you, because these are obviously very explosive conclusions that you've reached or you're reporting, could you talk a little bit about the archive sources that you have? In other words, I could understand the cell phone texts, let's say, between different parties involved in this being leaked. But you were even talking about audio. How was the audio compiled? Were these people taping their own conversations? Or could you discuss a little bit the nature of the documents that you have?
Sure. So when I say audio, generally what I mean is, and we haven't published any of the audios yet, so I'm reluctant to say much about them. But when I say audios, typically what I mean is not that they were taping their own conversations, but that they often communicated with one another using apps on telephones that enable you to either type out messages to people, to you text messages to people, or you can leave voicemail messages for people, essentially. So instead of typing some long message, you just click microphone on your telephone, you speak as a monologue, and you leave a message that way on somebody else's phone, which is a very common thing to do for people who use WhatsApp or Telegram or Signal. Those are the kinds of audios that I'm talking about. But because oftentimes, especially for complicated matters, you don't want to type huge paragraphs, you just want to speak, much of their communications, although it's not really technically taped, you end up getting a huge part of their conversation because they're speaking to one another in 1, 2, 3 minute monologues back and forth to one another. Those are the kinds of audios we have.
So I wanted to turn to a video you tweeted Monday of Sergio Moro speaking in 2016. He was a federal judge at the time.
Vamos colocar uma coisa muito clara, né? O que se ouve muito por aí.
Let's make something very clear. You hear a lot about Judge Moro's investigative strategy. I often say the public prosecutor's office, the federal police, and the subsidiary bodies are the ones responsible for that. I don't have any investigative strategy at all. The people who investigate or who decide what to do and such is the public prosecutor and the federal police. The judge is reactive. We say that a judge should normally cultivate these passive virtues, and I even get irritated at times. I see somewhat unfounded criticism of my work saying that I am a judge, investigator. I say go ahead and identify them. In my judicial decisions, a decision where I determine the production of legal proof without provocation. At most, I put together some documents for the eventual testimony of a witness. In this large haul of criminal cases, that's practically nothing.
And now I want to turn to former Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, in his own words, appearing on Democracy Now! In March 2018, just before he was jailed.
Now, if my innocence is proven, then Judge Moro should be removed from his position, because you can't have a judge who is lying in the judgment and pronouncing as guilty someone who he knows is innocent. He knows that it's not my apartment. He knows that I didn't buy it. He knows that I didn't pay anything. He knows that I never went there. He knows that I don't have money from Petrobras. The thing is that because he subordinated himself to the media, I said in the first hearing with him, you are not in a position to acquit me because the lies have gone too far. And the disgrace is that the one who tells the first lie continues lying and lying and lying to justify the first lie. And I'm going to prove that he has been lying.
So that is now jailed former President Lula Inácio da Silva. The Brazilian Bar Association has called for Moro to be suspended and for all prosecutors involved in the scandal to be disbanded. Yet, as you've pointed out, Bolsonaro made him a kind of super justice minister, bringing together the functions of law enforcement, surveillance, and investigation, which were distributed to several ministries, all under Moro's super justice minister position, making him, as you pointed out, Glenn Greenwald, the second most powerful person in Brazil now. So what happens?
So it's so fascinating because the story reminds me so much of the Snowden story in so many ways. One way, remember that the Snowden story essentially began when Snowden heard James Clapper go before the Senate and just look at them and just lie to their faces when he was asked, are you collecting data about millions of Americans? And he said, no, sir, we're not doing that. We have no such program. And it was shocking to Snowden to watch somebody in that high of a position so sociopathically lie. And that's the thing that finally drove Snowden to decide with finality, I need to show the truth. That's the same reaction I have when I listen to Judge Morrow look in the cameras and say, I get irritated at the notion that I have any involvement in the prosecution when I've now read all of the years' worth of documents and conversations that a lot of which we publish and will continue to publish, showing that he did exactly what he looked at the camera and with this smirk and just so smugly denied. It's just amazing, even though I guess it shouldn't be, the willingness of people in these high positions of authority to so sociopathically lie about what it is that they do. And then the second issue is, just like in the Snowden story where people for years suspected that the NSA was spying but were called conspiracy theorists or paranoid people, and then the evidence proved them right, everybody or a lot of people in Brazil have long said what Lula said, namely that Moro got into a position where he was forced to convict Lula, where he was single-mindedly obsessed with it, that the Brazilian elites were demanding that of him, and therefore he was willing to do anything, including breaking rules, breaking laws, in order to make that happen. They were called conspiracy theorists, they were called paranoid, they were called left-wing liars and ideologues who were only saying that to protect their leader. And as it turns out, what Lula said in that interview is absolutely right. And of course, the conviction that Sergio Moro issued, notwithstanding the fact that it was very quickly, very strangely quickly affirmed by an appellate court in time to make him ineligible to run, is now called into doubt because we know, because we've all seen the evidence, that the process that led to his conviction was deeply and inherently corrupted in the most basic way, because the person who found him guilty was doing exactly that which judges are prohibited from doing. And the Supreme Court will now decide whether that conviction can be maintained in light of what we've shown.
And Glenn, I want to ask you in a broader sense, this whole issue of corruption in government and prosecutors removing or being able to jail or remove elected officials or key political leaders. Clearly, in a democracy, there's in an industrial Western democracy, there's two ways to remove a leader. You vote them out of office, or you get them indicted and jailed and removed that way. To what extent is this a signal to people around the world and other countries about the kind of skepticism that you should have about investigations coming at the top leaders? And, of course, I'm sure there are people in the Trump supporters here in this country who would point to the FBI agent Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, the FBI counsel, as they were attempting to help remove Trump from office. But to what degree do you is this a warning for people in other countries to be wary and skeptical, even in the face of what seems initially to be damning evidence against a political leader?
Yeah, I mean, look, Juan, as you guys know, I've been one of the people, along with Noam Chomsky and Matt Taibbi and a few lonely others on the left, who have been skeptical of the Russiagate story, in part because we know that these agencies have a long history of lying. And the FBI and the CIA and the NSA in the U.S. were vehemently opposed to Donald Trump and wanted Hillary Clinton because they trusted her much more. And so there was a concern always on my part that they were abusing their prosecutorial powers to interfere in our domestic election in the United States in order to help the candidate they wanted to win and hurt the candidate that they wanted to lose. There were other factions in the FBI, by the way, who wanted Donald Trump to win desperately and did their own abuse of power to hurt Hillary Clinton's chances and help Donald Trump win. So there were two different factions inside these law enforcement agencies interfering in the U.S. election by abusing their power to help the two candidates they preferred, which is an incredible, that was the real meddling that was dangerous in the 2016 election. And of course, the parallel is very clear, which is that in Brazil, since 2002, the center-right, the oligarchical class, which, by the way, got kind of comfortable with Lula and PT, but nonetheless still wanted the center-right to be in power. And I asked Lula about that. Why would the elite be so opposed to you when the elite thrived under your presidency? Even though you lifted millions of people out of poverty, you weren't a socialist, you weren't Castro, you weren't Chavez. The markets in Brazil, the rich in Brazil, prospered under Lula. And he said it was cultural. They hated the fact that somebody who came from poverty was in the presidency, who doesn't speak perfect Portuguese, who didn't read until he was 10. They hated seeing in airports people who used to be invisible in the favelas now able to fly to visit their family, to be able to buy apartments. They hated it culturally. They felt like their Brazil was being taken away from them. And so they couldn't beat Lula. They couldn't beat the Workers' Party democratically. And so they abused the force of law in order to destroy the party that they couldn't beat politically. And this is a serious warning and a serious danger about why anytime people in power exercise power in secret, we need to be skeptical of them. All human beings. And I believe that these prosecutors began with good intentions. Brazil really is a country that has been plagued by corruption on the left and the right for a long time. They're young people. They're in their 30s. I believe they began with good intentions, but they became so drunk on their own power, nobody was questioning them. The large media here in Brazil, with the exception of Folha, one newspaper, stopped questioning what they were doing, just applauded for them, served as their tool. When you have that kind of faith being put into you, that kind of unquestioned power, as I'm not hardly the first person to observe, that kind of power corrupts people. And they got corrupted, they became politicized, and they became drunk on their own belief and their own goodness that they thought they were above the law and could break the rules because their ends justified the means. And it is an important lesson to learn about power in general.
And, of course, they ousted, impeached Dilma Rousseff before they imprisoned Lula. Finally, Glenn, very quickly, you've got this three-part series. It's rocking Brazil right now. Calls for Moro to go down, the super justice minister, calls for Lula to be released. What do you think is the chance of this? And finally, you're saying this is larger than a Snowden cache of information. You have much more information that you haven't released. What are you doing with it?
We are working feverishly to publish it as quickly as we can. Obviously, you know, there's a lot of desire to see more of it, but we have a responsibility, just like we did with the Snowden case, to make sure that what we're publishing is done well and professionally and accurately, because if we make a single mistake, they'll use that forever against us to undermine the credibility of the reporting. But definitely more is coming very soon. So when you ask what's going to happen with Moro, what's going to happen with Lula, a lot of it depends on how good of the reporting we do and how much more we show, which we have a lot more to show. But I believe even with just what we've shown, I'm not saying Sergio Moro is about to be put out of office because he still has the support of Bolsonaro. He's still crucial to the government. But certainly he's severely damaged and weakened and will continue to be more damaged and weakened as we reveal more. I'm not sure he can survive that. But I do think there's a good chance that the Supreme Court will say that the conviction of Lula da Silva was a byproduct of so much impropriety that we cannot let it stand, that at the very least he needs a new trial and needs to be let out of prison while this new trial proceeds.
Glenn Greenwald, we want to thank you for being with us. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, one of the founding editors of The Intercept, has just published The Secret Brazil Archive. We'll link to it at democracynow.org. When we come back, we look at the horrific conditions for immigrants in for-profit detention jails around the United States with Aura Bogado. Stay with us. Colors that you bring, Damon Locks and Black Monument Ensemble. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We end today's show looking at horrific conditions for some 52,000 immigrants held in for-profit jails around the country. At least 24 immigrants have died in the custody of Immigration and Customs Enforcement under the Trump administration. At least 4 more died shortly after being released. Now, Homeland Security's own Inspector General has revealed how detained immigrants are subjected to rotten food, severe overcrowding, inadequate medical care, and broken and overflowing toilets. In 2 facilities in particular, Delanto ICE Processing Center in California and Essex County Correctional Facility in New Jersey, the inspectors found, quote, immediate risks or egregious violations of detention standards, including nooses in detainee cells.
The inspectors showed up at these 4 detention jails unannounced between May and November 2018 in response to several concerns raised by immigration rights groups and complaints made by prisoners. The LaSalle ICE Processing Center in Louisiana, the Aurora ICE Processing Center in Colorado were also inspected. 3 of the facilities are operated by the private prison company Geo Group. This comes as a separate Inspector General report recently documented dangerous overcrowding at a Border Patrol processing facility in El Paso, Texas. Meanwhile, the Trump administration's announced it plans to hold some 1,400 immigrant children at a site on Fort Sill Army Base in Oklahoma that was once used as an internment camp for Japanese Americans during World War II. The agency is already holding a record number of children in some 168 facilities and programs in 23 states. For more, we go to Houston, Texas, where we're joined by Aura Bogado, immigration reporter for Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting. She's been speaking with migrants held in a number of these jails. Aura, welcome back to Democracy Now! There was not a lot of mainstream media attention on this Inspector General report. Again, the Inspector General for the Department of Homeland Security. Talk about what it revealed.
Good morning, Amy. It's great to be back. The Inspector General's report indicates what immigrants have said for years about conditions in various detention facilities. As you mentioned, the Inspector General's report did surprise visits to 4 sites. 3 of them are run by the private prison company Geo, and the other one is local to Essex County, New Jersey. And it's hard to know where to begin, but, some of what stands out are the photos, for example, from the bathroom facilities where there is unusable toilets, mildew and mold on the showers. The Inspector General said that this poses health risks to the detainees who are being held there. Little to no access to recreation, horrible food conditions, moldy bread, raw, leaking chicken blood, unmarked, unlabeled food. Again, things that we've heard about for years. And as you mentioned, this is the DHS Inspector General, and they found that there were multiple violations of ICE's own detention standards. And ICE concurred with the one recommendation, which was to have increased oversight. In some cases, they tried to make fixes right away, such as replacing the kitchen manager at one of the facilities during the inspection. But with some other recommendations, they sort of indicated that they'd think about it. For example, the Aurora facility in Colorado has a space for in-contact visits, which we know improves the morale of people who are being held in any kind of detention or prison environment. And although it has those facilities, it doesn't allow contact visits. And the Inspector General's report cited that. And ICE's response was, we'll think about it, but the standard isn't to have contact visits. So it's an interesting way to sort of skirt that particular issue, which was addressed in the report.
And Aura, could you talk some about the Geo Group for those viewers and listeners who may not be familiar with it?
Sure. So the Geo Group is a private prison contractor, And for ICE, it runs several detention facilities around the country, and it does, what it sounds like. It holds people for civil immigration custody. Something that I think people don't always understand is that people who are in immigration and ICE custody, they're in civil custody, not criminal custody. So it doesn't have to do with any kind of criminality. It's people who are going through some kind of immigration process, one of the many immigration processes that exist in the United States. And ICE contracts with a few contractors, but particularly with GEO, and they're a large firm that holds a lot of people around the country for this agency.
So can you talk about the significance of this report and specifically also the number of migrants who have died during the Trump administration? It's both children, a record number. I mean, I think the number was 6 from back to last year, and there hadn't been a child death in immigration detention in 10 years. And now you have this latest figure of, what was the number? 24 migrants. These are adults who died in detention, with another 4 dying right after they're released.
Right. So something to keep in mind is that there are various agencies that hold immigrants, asylum seekers, migrants. So we have just been talking about ICE immigration detention. The Customs and Border Patrol also holds people at Border Patrol stations, which are often referred to as hieleras, or ice boxes, by people who are held in them. They always describe them as being incredibly cold. I spent time with a couple of girls who I first reported on back in 2013, and they described in great detail, especially one of them, what the icebox was like. And, here we are years later. They have green cards now. They're looking forward to becoming citizens. And when we went back to talk about the conditions in these Border Patrol stations, it was like it could have happened yesterday. I mean, they just described how freezing they were, how the one little piece of Mylar didn't feel like enough for either of them. And the older sister felt so bad for the younger one that she took it and tried to create a second layer for her sister. And she was scared of sleeping through getting her name called, because they say that they were told that if they didn't hear their name, they would stay in there forever. So, again, this is stuff that we've heard about for a long time. Unaccompanied minors then who leave the Border Patrol stations are then taken to shelters around the country, which are run by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. These are all contracted facilities throughout the country, and that's a different department altogether. That's not DHS, but the Department of Health and Human Services. Some of what we found is tremendous abuse, both accusations and proven allegations, as well as, in some of these places there is the use of restraints, forced drugging. My reporting partner and I, Patrick Michaels and I, we've been investigating secret shelters in which the Office of Refugee Resettlement, without any judicial oversight, sends children to psychiatric facilities or residential treatment centers, and they're sort of off the map of the shelters that we do know about. They're not contracted facilities. And yes, people die. There are really horrible conditions in a lot of these places. And as you mentioned, there have been 24 deaths during the Trump administration. That accounts for the 200 or so deaths since we've been keeping track, which is since 2003, I believe. And then there have been 4 deaths immediately after custody. So those are also tricky to track. We think that it's 4 people who died immediately after being released. They may have been in custody when they were taken to a hospital and then paroled, essentially taken out of custody immediately thereafter. But these are pretty high numbers, and again, they come from places in which people have been detailing the horrid conditions for quite a long time.
And out of the Inspector General's report, from your own reporting, do you get the sense that they're actually talking to the detainees, or are they just basically inspecting the delivery of basic services and dealing with the personnel in these facilities?
You know, there's mention in the report where they cite that detainees said such and such things. Detainees noted that not having contact visits was difficult for them, for example. But that their actual perspective isn't included. There are no quotes from the detainees themselves in the report. And again, it's interesting, and I think it validates what people have been saying for a long time. But again, you know, for immigration reporters whose sources are the people who experience these policies, this isn't necessarily anything new. I think the photos do illustrate, however, exactly what has been described to me and many other reporters for quite a long time.
And now the Inspector General report author, John Kelly, not the General John Kelly, who's gone on to the board of another for-profit detention facility, is resigning after this report has come out. But finally, the Trump administration saying it's going to suspend legal aid programs, recreational activities, even English classes, all education for unaccompanied migrant children jailed in federally run immigration centers. The move drawing condemnation from groups like Amnesty International USA, which wrote, "It's bad enough the Trump administration is trying to normalize the warehousing of children. It's unconscionable that they would so blatantly try to strip them of their rights. Locking up children, then denying them legal aid, education, and even playtime is all part of this administration's cruel efforts to dehumanize people who've come to the U.S. seeking safety." Those are the words of Amnesty International USA. And yet you have President Trump taking $8 billion to build a wall and saying he doesn't have money for kids having classes.
Yeah, again, my reporting partner, Patrick Michaels, actually broke that story on Twitter recently, and it was surprising to see that memo, that email, which internally stated we're not, providing English classes right now. We're not providing football or soccer recreation services. And as you note, there is quite an irony in saying that there isn't funding available for something really basic, like, how much does a soccer ball
we're going to have
cost?
to leave it there. Immigration reporter with Reveal. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.